Good evening. Welcome to the Lux Center for Catholic Jewish Studies Winter Webinar Series, Jewish Studies Seminar for Christians, the Jewish People in the Church. My name is Bonnie Schaffer, and I'm the director of the Lux Center for Catholic Jewish Studies at Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology, and I will serve as the moderator for this evening's program. The Lux Center is proud to be the only program for Catholic Jewish studies to be located within a Roman Catholic seminary. It is our mission to strengthen the living relationship between Catholics and the Jewish people by first providing seminarians with the educational experiences that will offer them the knowledge of the Jewish roots of Christianity and a positive understanding of Catholic-Jewish relations. The Lux Center also offers programs such as this one to the larger community. I wish to express my sincere thanks to Brittany Hager McNeely for lending her time and technological expertise to make sure that this webinar works seamlessly. I thank Father Raul Gomez, President Rector of Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology, for his encouragement and support, the priests of the Sacred Heart who support the Lux Center in so many ways, and to the Harry Hoffman Family Foundation for granting us the funds to enable this program to be presented to you. The Lux Center is able to do the work necessary to fulfill its mission with the financial support of individuals like you and grants from private foundations. If you appreciate what we do, we ask you to go to the Lux Center web pages, click on how can we help, and consider making a donation to the Lux Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. We are pleased to be able to present to you this Jewish Studies Seminar Series that addresses the answers to questions that as Christians you may have thought about but were too afraid to ask. We hope that you will ask questions, and in order to ask a question, you will find a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If you click on the Q&A, you can type in your question at any time during the presentation. After our speakers' presentations, there will be time for me to choose some of your questions for our speakers to address. The topic for tonight's session is, how should we approach Jerusalem, a Jewish Christian dialogue? It will be presented by two internationally acclaimed scholars. First of all, Dr. Ruth Langer is Professor of Jewish Studies in the Theology Department at Boston College in Boston, Massachusetts. She's also the interim director of Boston College's Center for Christian Jewish Learning and the past chair of the Council of Centers on Jewish Christian Relations, of which the Lux Center is very proud to be a member. Dr. Philip Cunningham is professor of theology, specializing in Christian Jewish relations, and director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's also the past president of the International Council of Christians and Jews. Both scholars have authored and edited several books and have published many articles in their field. Most recently, Dr. Langer and Dr. Cunningham have contributed to and co-edited with Dr. Jesper Svartvik, a recently published book, Enabling Dialogue About the Land, a resource book for Jews and Christians. And it's published by Paulus Press. Can you see it? Not sure. Maybe you can or not. Hang on a second. Make sure. I don't know. I may have to hold it up later. Anyway, this book is an important contribution to addressing the complex issues involved in discussions of theologies and connections to the land, meaning Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim perspectives. I highly recommend it to anyone who teaches or studies scripture, or anyone who wants to know why this tiny speck of land is so central to so many people, and why those participating in Catholic Jewish dialogues find that the discussion of Israel proves to be so challenging. This is the main reason why the book was written, and we hope that this session adds to your knowledge and understanding. We are very pleased and honored to welcome Dr. Ruth Langer and Dr. Philip Cunningham. Feel free to type in your questions at any time during the session. Questions will be answered after our speakers finish their presentation, and we will begin now with a short video.
At the crossroads of history, forged by centuries of conflict, is a place once believed to be the center of the world. Jerusalem. National Geographic Entertainment invites you to explore a land cherished by billions. For the first time on the world's largest screens. Experience this ancient city through the stories of people who call it home. A mosaic of cultures and beliefs. Ancient rituals. Secrets buried deep underground. Jerusalem. Coming soon to IMAX and giant screen theaters near you.
The pictures that you just watched give you a bit of a taste of the place that we're going to be looking at today and the questions that we're going to be asking. How should we approach Jerusalem? About 3,000 years ago, according to the Bible, King David conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites and made it his capital, bringing to it the most holy object of his people, the ark containing the 10 Commandments from Sinai. His son, Solomon, built on the city's highest point a magnificent temple to house that ark. By the 7th century BCE, this became the only legitimate place for Jews to offer their official worship of God. Deuteronomy speaks of Jerusalem as the place chosen by God to dwell among humanity. But shortly after the cult was centralized in 586 BCE, the Babylonians conquered the city, exiling its leadership and demolishing its temple. Psalm 137 records the pain of this moment. Al naharot Bavel sham yashavnu gam bachinu, b'zochrenu et Zion. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in my memory, even at my happiest hour. For the psalmist, Zion, one of the hills of Jerusalem, served as a synecdoche for Jerusalem. And I know that's an SAT word, meant that this Mount Zion, one of the hills, stood as a word representing the whole of the city. And Jerusalem itself was a synecdoche for the entirety of the land at whose heart it stood, and in many, many ways still stands. The psalmist in exile mourned for his home, unable to utter its songs, vowing to hold on to this grief, even in times of joy. The exiles were able to return from Babylonia after about 50 years. As soon as they could, they rebuilt Jerusalem and its holy place. This city and its shrine served as the center of Judean worship under the domination of first Persia, then Greece, then Rome. Herod the Great, a Roman puppet king, a cruel man with what some describe as an edifice complex, immensely expanded the temple itself, creating one of the wonders of the ancient world. This is the place where Jesus joined his fellow Jews in worship, except that one Passover season, almost 2,000 years ago, the Romans crucified him just outside the city walls. A few decades later, the Jews rebelled against Rome, and the Roman victory was sealed with their destruction of their temple and its city and the city of Jerusalem. Once again, Jews were exiled from this holy city and from the mountaintop chosen by God for the divine earthly dwelling. This exile fundamentally shaped subsequent Judaism. Theologically, this exile still exists, even though the thriving modern city of Jerusalem and state of Israel suggest a significant modification of it. How did this exile from Jerusalem shape Judaism? First, Jerusalem and its Jewish focal point, the temple, remained the geographic center of the Jewish world. The Bible itself records this role of place, of space in Jewish thought, beginning with God's covenants with the patriarchs in Genesis. There, God promises to Abraham and reiterates to his son Isaac and grandson Jacob, later renamed Israel, not just relationship, not just multitudes of descendants, but critically, God also gives them what comes to be called the land of Israel as a permanent home. Judaism takes this promise seriously. At the same time, there are multiple biblical definitions of the boundaries of the land. So we need to understand the land as more of a concept than a concretely defined entity, although its general location on or near the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, south of Lebanon, and north of Egypt is clear. Rabbinic tradition teaches that when the Romans destroyed the temple and exiled the Jews from Jerusalem, God's indwelling presence, God's Shekhinah, remained on the temple's western wall. Probably this teaching did not originally apply to what we think of today as the Western Wall, the retaining wall of the Herodian platform, as depicted in this old photo, but it referred to the shrine itself. However, it came to apply to this one accessible part of the platform, here in a picture from very recently, a vast plaza cleared to create a huge outdoor synagogue. On one of my first visits to this wall, on the holiest evening of the Jewish year, I felt in my bones that this was the focal point of global Jewish prayer. Thus, I was not surprised when I learned of the rabbinic teaching that no matter where one is in the world, one should direct one's prayer to Jerusalem and to the holiest locus in it. As the conclusion of this text states explicitly, the purpose of this is that all Israel, all Jews, will direct their prayers to a single location. This determines the orientation of synagogues, I've also seen travel-sized prayer books with compasses on their covers. And today, one can even acquire a Jerusalem compass app for one's phone. Indeed, one can virtually visit the wall at any hour, including sending texts of prayers to be placed in its cracks. This centrality of Jerusalem has shaped Jewish practice in myriads of other ways through the centuries as well. The land's centrality is not merely geographic. Jews understand that the Messianic age lies in the future, and substantial elements of traditional Jewish Messianic expectations revolve around a restored national and religious life in this land. The restoration of divinely ordained governance, the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple, the ingathering of the exiles, including the resurrected dead, all of these take place in Jerusalem and its surroundings. Each of these elements is very complex, especially in the modern period, but they have shaped Jewish hopes and expectations for more or less 2,000 years. That in and of itself makes them important. So some more concrete examples. The liturgy recited in today's synagogues emerged in this world of exile and loss. Thus, one of its central themes was and remains this messianic redemption. The central weekday prayer, in its traditional form, recited 3 times daily on weekdays and heard 2 more times in communal prayer for a total of 30 times a week, ask God for specific elements of this salvation. Gather us together from the 4 corners of the earth. Blessed are you, O Lord, who gathers together the dispersed of his people Israel. Restore our judges as in the beginning. In other words, a prayer for sound political leadership. To Jerusalem, your city, may you return with mercy and dwell in the midst of it as you have spoken, and build it soon and in our day as an eternal structure. The throne of David quickly establish. Blessed are you, O builder of Jerusalem. And may our eyes behold you return to Zion with compassion. Blessed are you, O Lord, who returns your presence, your Shekhinah, to Zion. This list could be much expanded. Indeed, once one is alert to this theme, it becomes liturgically omnipresent. It is rather obvious that it would dominate the summer fast day, the 9th of Av, the anniversary of the destructions of both temples and associated with dozens of subsequent tragedies in Jewish history. But it is less obvious that a prayer for the rebuilding of Jerusalem would pop up in numerous day-to-day situations, like in the grace recited after every meal, or the blessings following a prophetic reading. Much of this follows the prompt of Psalm 137. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. The most extreme expression of this is at a Jewish wedding, which in its totality is an expression of immense, overflowing communal joy, not just in the love of the couple, but in the hope, the optimism for the future that this new family embodies. Fundamental to the ceremony itself, but also recited for the couple at the conclusion of the feast that follows, and then anytime a community gathers with them for a meal for the full week following. The 7 wedding blessings express this most clearly. Thematically, they tie the joy of the first wedding, that of Adam and Eve, and those are the themes highlighted in green, to the anticipated joy of weddings in Messianic Jerusalem, and those are highlighted in purple. The 5th blessing even praises God explicitly for bringing joy to the barren Jerusalem, in other words, the city whose children have been exiled, and by gathering them in again to create that joy. Then the seventh blessing, mustering all the synonyms for joy that Hebrew can produce, anticipates that the intense joy of the current wedding day will only be a foretaste of the joy that will fill the streets of Jerusalem in Messianic era weddings. But we are not at that time yet. So a Jewish wedding takes a moment at the very end to recall that reality. Traditional weddings, and these pictures are from my daughter's wedding, end with singing from Psalm 137, "If I Forget You, O Jerusalem," to a somber melody. Some couples put ashes on their foreheads as a mark of this mourning. Then something, often a glass, is broken to remind us that our joy, however great, is not complete. Of course, that breaking of the glass serves as the symbol to transition into absolutely full party mode, which is what happens immediately thereafter. So how should we approach Jerusalem? So far, I've shared the theology, the yearning through the ages. But Jerusalem is also a real, living, breathing, seething place today. Jerusalem is a complex metropolitan area of almost 1 million. Since 1948, the capital of the state of Israel. Since 1967, fully under Israeli jurisdiction. It is a city of contrasts, of the iconic mile square walled old city, of beautiful new civic architecture, of magnificent private homes, and of slums, of religious zealots and of secularists, of Jews and Christians and Muslims, of dreams of peace, and a city of terrorism. It's also a city where one finds pop artists using the Bible to comment on modern culture. You see the three people all with their heads in their cell phones. And you find tens of thousands participating in an annual gay pride parade when it's not a pandemic. This blocks away from an extremely conservative community. It's a city where disputes rage over its holy sites and control of them, access to them. But its name means city of peace. It's a city where living in or striving for coexistence is often a daily matter. May it become even more so.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Ruth. I would like to share my screen also, if you'd give me a second to do that. So thanks to the Lux Center for the invitation to be with you this evening, and also thank you for giving me and Ruth a welcome chance to work together. Thanks, Ruth, for this lovely overview of how Jerusalem and Israel are so important in the Jewish tradition and for Jewish spirituality. I'm going to sketch what the religious significance that the land of Israel might have from a Catholic perspective. So it's going to be more focused on what the Jewish religious attachment to this land might mean for Catholics. And I have to begin by saying that, in fact, over history, the land of Israel's holiness for Jews has really not meant a whole lot for the Catholic tradition. And I think it's fair to say that we have a rather undeveloped theology of the land of Israel in terms of what its significance is for Jews. Now, I think there's several reasons for this undevelopment or lack of development. First of all, we Christians in general have no parallels to the way the particular land of Israel is central to Jewish spirituality. There's no particular piece of land on earth that has that same spiritual relevance for Christians. Yes, it's true that there is a history of pilgrimages to the land where Jesus walked, but again, that's not essential to how we understand our covenant with God in Christ. We Christians rather have stressed the universality of what God has done through Christ, that all of humankind is impacted and saved. And over history, Christians, including Catholics, have long denied that there is any legitimacy to Jewish attachment to the land after the coming of Christ. The Jewish way of covenanting with God, we taught for centuries, had terminated with Christ, and therefore there's no reason for Jews to have any kind of connection to the land in any legitimate way. And I should also say that Catholics and most Jews as well were not really expecting the appearance of a modern Jewish state in 1948. In a certain sense, its establishment has surprised us all and caught us short in terms of our theologies. And finally, something that makes the Catholic consideration of the land and state of Israel highly distinctive is the fact that the Catholic Church has an ecclesial structure that is centered on a nation state or a city state, the Holy See, which has a diplomatic corps. It has diplomatic relations with many countries, including with Israel. And so unlike other Christian churches, the Vatican has to deal with the diplomatic and legal aspects of what it means to be in relationship with a state in the land of Israel. Now, there has not been much text written about a Catholic teaching about the land and state of Israel precisely for these reasons I have here. The single most important statement, the lengthiest statement on the topic comes from 1985 from the Commission for Vatican Relations with the Jews, this document that I'll abbreviate by referring to as the notes from 1985. And here in section 6, paragraph 25 of the document, if you want to look it up, here is what it has to say about Israel, and using that word to denote the land and the state and the people thereof. So the Vatican in this commission document says that Christians should understand Jewish religious ties to the land. We should try and appreciate the significance and the centrality of the land of Israel for the Jewish spiritual tradition. But we shouldn't adopt any particular interpretation of that attachment as our own. Secondly, the state of Israel as a political entity should not be viewed in religious terms primarily, or really at all, it says, but in terms of international law and its participation in the family of nations. Thirdly, this Vatican document said that the permanence of the Jewish people over the centuries, despite persecutions and exile and genocide, is a theological datum that has to be interpreted as something within God's design. Now, this is a sort of a tension you can see in this document. It's trying to say, on the one hand, politically, we should not attribute religious significance to the land because it exists because a Jewish state has been established there. But there is perhaps a theological significance to the Jewish attachment to the land because God has maintained God's covenant with the Jewish people, as is witnessed by the fact that they're still here despite centuries of horrible experiences. And rooted in all of this is the fundamental conviction, I'll say more, in Catholic teaching today, is that Jews remain a chosen people. Now, with that, I'd like to suggest certain parameters in which Catholic thinkers and theologians need to operate in trying to answer the question, does Jewish attachment religiously to the land of Israel have a significance for Catholic faith? And I see this in terms of a couple of parameters. First, maybe most importantly, in the Catholic Church, the Bible is understood as the Word of God written in human language. Interpreting the Bible in Catholic teaching is an interactive process between the faith of the people that wrote the biblical text and the faith of readers today. And it's the interaction of modern readers with the biblical text that develops what the meaning of the text is for us today. Now, what this means in terms of questions about the land of Israel, it means that the Bible itself does not give us the answers. The Bible does not address 21st century issues, and they have to be therefore engaged with in terms of the interaction between the church community and the biblical text. The second, and incidentally, this distinguishes how the Catholic Church finds a meaning in the Bible from the way certain other Christian traditions do, particularly those that have a sola scriptura approach to interpreting biblical texts. This is why the Catholic Church's approach to the land and state of Israel will sometimes be similar to other Christians and sometimes different. We can talk more about that later, perhaps. The second parameter that I think guides Catholic engagement with the question of the land and state of Israel is that we understand that revelation is relational. And for more on this, see John Paul II's Fides et Ratio encyclical. To sum it up, Catholic theology holds that when God discloses God's self, it requires human interactions with that revelation of God, or else there really hasn't been any experience of God occurring. The way that Fides et Ratio puts it is that the human participants in revelation need to make a decision of faith. For example, if I see a beautiful sunset, I might experience a transcendent moment and feel God's presence. Well, that perception or that impression may not be shared by somebody standing right next to me who witnesses the exact same thing but attributes no religious significance to it. A decision of faith is needed. Therefore, religious truth claims that are based on revelation are subjective experiences of the transcendent. And those subjective experiences are not necessarily shared by everybody. Now, what this means in terms of the land and state of Israel is that somebody outside a particular religious group or religious culture is not going to be persuaded by religiously based claims made by another group about the land. So, for example, if some Jews were to claim that the land of Israel belongs to us today because God gave her to Abraham, well, that is not going to be automatically accepted by Muslims or even by Christians necessarily. So this understanding that revelation is a two-way street between God and human beings is important. More on this to come. Third Catholic parameter is that human dignity must always be a priority. And one way of expressing this in terms of the Middle East is that theology cannot be used to justify violence. It cannot be used to justify oppression or injustice against Israelis, against Palestinians, against Jews, Muslims, Christians, in short, against anyone. So the priority of the respect for the human being is very strong and axiomatic in the Catholic teaching tradition. And an additional fourth parameter, as I've already mentioned, is that the Catholic Church affirms that Jews remain in covenant with God, that covenant, that relationship of deep intimacy and love never was revoked. It did not terminate with the crucifixion of Jesus, as was taught for so many centuries. And this means that when Catholics are thinking about what the significance of the land might be for us, the land of Israel, we have to consider Jewish self-understanding because that Jewish self-understanding is born out of a real relationship with God. Pope Francis has seen a political conclusion to this, which means that the state of Israel has every right to exist in safety and prosperity. So these four parameters are, I think, what must guide Catholic reflection. And let me conclude with some consideration of this question. Can the spiritual centrality of the land of Israel for Jews have religious significance for Catholics? Now, I want to pause on that question a minute because it's a very focused and precise one. Can the spiritual centrality of the land of Israel for Jews that Ruth beautifully summarized earlier, does that have or can it have religious significance for the Catholic community? I think on a kind of minimalistic level, the answer has to be yes. And the reason why I think it has to be yes is because the Jewish connection to the land is an aspect of their covenantal relationship with God, which the Catholic Church affirms. Therefore, in principle, Catholics can be edified, can be inspired, can gain spiritual meaning from the Jewish connection to the land. Now, I say that with the caution that we have not seen things that way for almost 2,000 years. That's another story. I've already touched on aspects of it earlier. But I would like to suggest that there are three more specific theological approaches that in the future might put sort of flesh on the bones in terms of how Jewish attachment to the land can be spiritually significant for Catholics. The first approach is what I'll call an ecological approach. And here I would cite Pope Francis's recent encyclical Laudato Si, where he says, human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the planet Earth itself. Now, following that sort of three-part relationship, that global reality could be seen as embodied in the particular Jewish experience of the living covenantal connection between the God of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel. So just as all of humanity is in an intertwined relationship between God with fellow human beings and with the planet, so in a specific and particular way, Jewish covenantal relationship with the land can be seen as sort of paradigmatic of the relationship with the planet that all of us have. And I kind of like this approach because in the past, Christians so emphasized the universality of Christ that it dismissed any Jewish particularity in any form, let alone regarding the land. And so to affirm now that the Jewish connection to the land could be symbolic or be a synecdoche of the larger human relationship to the planet, that's sort of appealing to me. A second approach is what we could call a sacramental approach. And here I remind us of Richard Lux's book on this subject, The Jewish People, the Holy Land, and the State of Israel, a Catholic View, in which he discusses sacramental approach to this question in a little bit of a different way than I do here, but it's a very worthwhile contribution to the discussion. What I mean by a sacramental approach is that the spiritual connection between Jews and the land of Israel could be seen as a sacrament of God's eternal covenantal fidelity to the children of Israel. I don't mean sacrament in the formal sense of the 7 sacraments of the church, but sacramentally as pointing to the relationship of the Jewish people and God. There is a sort of qualifier, a caveat here, in that in Catholic theology, events or experiences that mediate the divine presence, i.e. are sacramental, by their nature always need to reflect the life of the reign of God or the life of the age to come, what Jews call Olam Haba. Presently, it's kind of hard for me to discern sort of life in the land of Israel, the state of Israel, the Palestinian territories, etc., as reflecting the life of the kingdom of God in any way that's superior to any other place on earth. So I think the sacramental approach is a potential way of gaining spiritual enrichment from Jewish religious attachment to the land. And finally, a third possible approach would be what I'll call covenantal restoration. By this I mean, could the return of Jews to self-governance in the land of Israel have a spiritual significance as an act of God, restoring the covenanting Jewish people after disaster. This is a pattern one sees in the Christian Bible in both Testaments, that when God's people experience disaster, that God is nonetheless ever faithful and brings new life out of the ashes of defeat. And in a sense, the raising of the crucified Jesus from the dead can be viewed as an act of covenantal restoration. So is Jewish return to the land something like that? Again, since Revelation is relational, if you remember that earlier parameter, for Christians to see God at work in the birth of the state of Israel would require a decision of faith. It's just not something that would be obvious to any observer. One has to say, oh, I believe that God is at work here. But that decision becomes more difficult in the absence of tranquility and peace, it seems to me. So again, this is an approach that is a latent or possible one that hopefully the future will make more real. So let me conclude by saying, number one, Jewish religious attachment to the land of Israel may come to have spiritual meaning for Catholics. Two, the founding of the state of Israel could express God's faithfulness to the people of Israel. Now, this is almost a quote from something that Emeritus Pope Benedict wrote in 2018. Where he said the state of Israel could express God's faithfulness to the people of Israel. And he didn't say any more about it. He didn't develop this thought. It was almost I don't want to say casual line, but certainly an undeveloped one. But it somewhat reflects on what I was saying with the second and third possible approaches. The more the life of the age to come is seen in the land, the greater its positive impact will be on the world. And lastly, for the Catholic Church, achieving a just and viable political reality for Palestinian prosperity is absolutely vital. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to both of you. You've given us a lot to think about. I think what's very apparent about both of your presentations is how differently Catholics and Jews view or have a different perspective on the land of Israel. That's very apparent. And one of the reasons, as I said before, for your writing or your editing the book or contributing to the book, Enabling Dialogue About the Land. Oh, now we can see it. Okay. Oops.
Yeah,
Can you see it?
I think if you hold it in front of yourself, your background won't wipe it
I'm
out.
gonna take my background off. How about if we do that?
We have this problem all the time. There you go.
Okay. I want everybody to see the book. Is because it's a difficult topic when it comes to dialoguing, and both of you are very experienced in Christian Jewish dialogues. Can you talk a little bit about what are the difficulties of speaking about the land when it comes up in dialogue conversations?
You're starting off with a difficult question, Bonnie.
They're all, you'll see, they're all difficult. So,
part of the problem is that, as I tried to end with my PowerPoint, it's such a complicated place, and there are so many things which are so lovely and so good, and there are so many things which are so messy and so awful, and I didn't even begin to show everything from both points of view. Maybe for fairness, should have showed some examples of Jewish terrorism too, because that also exists. And so people want easy answers in our age, and to try to bring them into some of the messiness of the land and the state of Israel and the people Israel, and to do that with love, and to learn to do that appreciation of messiness with love is really important. And maybe we can appreciate that better some ways when we see the problems that our country, the United States, is having right now, that we're seeing a country which is, things are extremely messy from no matter which perspective you want to take. And yet, in some ways, we love it. And we hope for things to get better. So on the one hand, I'm really nervous about the sort of eschatological demands that Phil was making, the hopes for, this superhuman perfection in many ways, which are necessary in order to, are they necessary to have as aspirations? That's not problematic. Are they necessary for us to get to the point of being on good relations with each other? If they are, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, no.
I mean, Phil and I have been good friends for a long time now. And so we could disagree with each other quite happily. But that's where I was picking up on what Phil was saying and saying, wait a minute. Because if we have to get to the point where all the human rights issues and all the violence issues are solved before we can start building good relationships, we're not going to get there very easily.
So let me say that wasn't what I was saying, but I think to ascribe religious significance to a modern historical event, in this case, the establishment of the State of Israel by a United Nations vote, requires, I think, that there be some resonance with the values that both Jews and Christians see as the future destiny of all of creation, that we see that our lives are moving in the direction of shalom and justice and fellowship, et cetera, et cetera. And it just becomes hard for modern events to mediate that kind of a vision when they're not obvious. That's all I'm saying. I don't think perfection is a sine non qua. I'm not saying that right, but to find spiritual value, which was my specific question, I think some obvious resonating with our expectations for the reign of God or the age to come have to be present, or else it's just very difficult. That's all.
Okay,
Which I shy away from a little bit,
Yeah.
only because that's one of the issues within Jewish approaches and Jewish understandings of this modern state.
Yeah, which makes me, I want to reply to Bonnie's question very quickly, and because this question is starting to come in, that one of the reasons that we were part of this project that led to this book is that often when Jews and Christians come together to talk about the state of Israel or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or whatever, is that they bring with them unconscious assumptions that color their interaction with people with different points of view. And we wanted, in the book, there's a curriculum that helps to make or to bring to the surface the presuppositions that might be there. And I'll just give a very quick example. There is the curriculum part of the book contains little quotations from various documents by churches or Jewish organizations or individuals, whatever. And in one of the sessions that we provide materials for, there is a statement from a Protestant Christian body that suggests that Israel, the state of Israel, needs to be held to a higher standard than other nations are. And when that was discussed, there were folks that said, no, that's unfair, that's unjust. And it was largely Jewish voices that expressed this reservation. The following session, there is a statement from the Reform movement in the United States that, lo and behold, says the state of Israel ought to be motivated and guided by values that are a light and an example to the nations. It's basically saying the same thing that the Protestants did. Now, I'm not claiming that's a good or a bad value or belief or something everyone should affirm. My point is that people coming together assume certain things about what the other's positions are. Whereas when you actually get into what some people say, you find out that the categories you've brought to the discussion may be totally off base, and hence you can have real conversation. That's what one of the things the book aims to do.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question quickly. Richard Lux sent in. He said, "Thank you for such thoughtful presentations. Could you both comment on the 1993 fundamental agreement with the Holy See in Israel, especially in regard to the religious theological aspect of the relationship?"
I'll kick this one off if you like. So this is the document that Dr. Lux refers to. Hi, Rich. Is the formal diplomatic text that established or began the short process of establishing formal diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the State of Israel. So it is a legal document. It is a document of international law, if you like, speaking broadly. What's unusual about the document is that it contains in it some religious affirmations, particularly that the Holy See and the State of Israel both commit themselves to fighting anti-Semitism wherever it occurs, for instance. They also both the State of Israel guarantees the freedom of religion and property rights of Christian entities within the land of Israel, that those will be adjudicated in a legal process, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of language you would not see in a typical document establishing diplomatic relations between two entities. But it is not a religious document in any kind of formal sense. And someone else has asked a related question, if I could touch on it. Someone asked, are there reasons Catholics should privilege Jewish ties to the land over ties felt by others like Palestinian residents, let's say by Arabs, by Muslims living in the land? And this kind of relates to the fundamental agreement. That 1985 Vatican notes that I described briefly in my remarks would say, no, Jewish ties to the land should not be privileged by Catholics in a legal and political sense. That is a matter of international law to settle property rights. But that does not mean that there's not religious significance to Jews being in the land. So this is a distinction that the Catholic Church tries to maintain between questions that are purely political in nature from questions that are purely religious in nature, recognizing that those often are not pure categories.
And I would add to that and roll off exactly that last sentence, which is that in Jewish understanding, these are hardly categories at all, and that every aspect of life is inherently religious, and the secular is almost non-existent in Jewish theology.
But in Jewish law or in Israeli law
is a little bit different.
Right.
If we're not asking a theological question, then the state itself has religious value. And so and that state then in all its capacities, in its capacity to have diplomatic relationships with other states, that's part of its being and being an entity before God. So the very distinction between religious and secular, which is fundamental to the way that the Vatican has approached Israel, and that the world in many ways approaches Israel, is something which inherently within a traditional Jewish worldview doesn't exist. So that prayer that I showed you that gets recited up to 30 times a week, and sometimes even more if there's a holiday, that those prayers are fundamentally asking for the restoration of a state with good governance and getting rid of the nasty people in the government. So, or in the state. Everything that you need to make a healthy state is part of a daily prayer for Jews. And the other side, the flip side of this, is that the prayer for the government that was created for the state of Israel, pretty soon after it was created, speaks of the state as the beginning of the sprouting of our redemption. So it is in itself, it's not a realization of eschatological messianic dreams, but it's a glimmer in that direction. It's part of the bringing of the world and the Jewish people as our part of the world into right relationship with the world and with God. So these various categories, these ways of separating things out become problematic. And so while the state of Israel, dominated by Jews who are not inherently religious in their way of acting, very European in their way of acting, European secular in their way of acting and thinking in many ways, entered into diplomatic relations with the Vatican and with many other countries in the world, and recently with a whole series of Arab countries. This is it's not a purely secular thing to do within a Jewish context.
But Ruth, you would agree that if a case went before an Israeli court about land ownership of a particular piece of land, I don't really care where it is, that ideally that Israeli court would not be motivated by biblical texts in rendering their decision. They'd judge the case on the merits legally, and who had the deeds and who, passed the deed on, blah, blah, blah.
But the question is, how does that law get established and what informs that law?
Sure. Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Israeli law is a complex mixture of bits of Ottoman law from the Turkish era and British mandatory law,
yep,
and what has been developed in the state itself. But that can be, and in some cases really is, informed by the rabbinic legal traditions that come ultimately from the Talmud in many cases, but with another 1,500 years of development since then. And much of that is then grounded in the Bible.
Yep.
So the ways that the land ownership laws, which are governed by the Jewish National Fund in many ways, that sense of relationship to the land does spring from
Sure.
them.
Yeah.
So it is there.
Oh, I didn't say it was absent. I'm just saying there is also a secular dimension that gets invoked when you're talking.
Right, but no, is a lawyer likely to come into the court waving a Bible?
Right. Yeah.
No, right. But that is imbued in the national language.
Sure.
The very fact that you speak Hebrew in that court.
Okay, thank you. That was a good discussion.
We could go on, but let's get another question.
So you brought up the messianic piece of the land, and so there's a question relating to that. Has the line of King David been tracked through the ages to present day for messianic lineage purposes?
That's going to depend on who you ask.
We're asking you.
Well, no, I mean, so in some senses, yes. I believe that the former Lubavitcher Rebbe, who died in the 1990s, was understood. His followers were proclaiming him the Messiah on the understanding that he was of descent from King David. If you go to one of these genealogy sites and you say, connect me to King David, it probably would get there. My son did it and got us connected back to Adam, for what it's worth. There's no way that we know that, but there are these kinds of traditions. In fact, my father-in-law's family has a tradition of its being descended from Don Isaac Abravanel, who was an important Jew in the late 15th century when Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. He lost a lot of money because he wasn't paid back by Ferdinand and Isabella. But he was supposedly of Davidic descent. So there are families with that kind of tradition. And the various people who have claimed to be messiahs through history, and there have been people claiming to be messiahs, well, aside from the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the 1990s, but the most famous of Shabbatai Tzvi in the 1660s or thereabouts. Also, a sine qua non requirement for these people to have credibility was their ability to claim Davidic descent. So it's out there. Do most people think about it very much? No.
Phil, do you have any
I don't
thoughts?
think about it very much either.
Okay. Thank you. We're glad to know that. Okay. So what do Jewish thinkers make of the long gap between the Roman destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE and 1948?
The answer to that is going to depend on who you ask, obviously. But 1948, question is whether 1948 had real theological significance or just pointed to more theological hope. And for
Well put.
some people, especially the people we call the religious Zionists, especially important within the settler movement, the ideological settler movement, this is something which was deeply, deeply messianic and part of God's fulfillment of God's promises, especially when Jerusalem was united in 1967 and the heart of the biblical homeland, which is the West Bank, became under Israeli control. So for them, this was extremely intensely important as a sign that God was fulfilling God's promises to end this exile. There are many others who would say that, and this is how I tried to present it, that fundamentally we are still in exile, in that we do not have peace, we do not have prosperity, we have reasonable kind of prosperity, but not an ultimate kind of prosperity. We certainly don't have peace. Biblical worship of God has not been reestablished, and that's an extremely dangerous point, because the place where that worship will need to take place is currently the big, beautiful 7th century Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim shrine, and it would be World War III or Armageddon, depending which way you want to frame it, if something were to happen there. There is no way in a situation of peace and a situation of even world approbation, which is not as important as peace, that will be resolved. And so we are in many ways very, very far from an end to the exile. Jerusalem, yes, we can live in Jerusalem, we can celebrate holidays in the city of Jerusalem, but we're not living in a rebuilt Jerusalem. It's rebuilding in many ways, but not in the ultimate way that matters. So that hope that has been really central to Jewish life since 70 or shortly thereafter remains central, and central in different ways and in different dimensions to Jews in different parts of the Jewish world.
Could I piggyback on Ruth's comment, which I found really insightful, really meaningful to me, but somebody asked a question which relates to what Ruth was just saying that I'd like to make a quick reply to, and that is, what do you make of the evangelical zeal for the rebuilding of the temple, which is sort of, let's make the Messianic age happen now, by building a third temple and resuming animal sacrifice, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to say that from a Catholic perspective, that kind of a zeal is based upon a way of reading the Bible that the Catholic Church rejects. In other words, it's reading the Bible as a sort of roadmap to future events, that if we read the Bible, we can sort of say, aha, first this is going to come and that is going to happen, and then this thing will occur. And this mode of reading the Bible has been around for centuries. People around the year 1000 were predicting the end of the world was near. because of the turn of the calendar, and they read the Bible, the Christian Bible, accordingly to try and get them there. And I'm not saying this is not the questioner's point of view, obviously, but it is out there in the Christian world. And as I say, for the Catholic tradition, that is not respecting the nature of the Bible as incarnated in human speech and in the human historical condition, and that has to be reckoned with. And it sort of disrespects the way inspiration works to try and map out sort of predictions based on biblical texts. And for Christians, let me just end by saying there's a number of New Testament passages that attribute to Jesus statements like, don't try and figure out the day or the hour. The Father has reserved that to himself. So it's a fraught endeavor, and at least in the Catholic community is looked upon with grave suspicion.
Thank you. Are there reasons Catholics should privilege Jewish ties to the land over the ties felt by others, like Palestinian residents?
So I touched on that question earlier. I don't know if Ruth wants to add anything to it, but that the Catholic tradition would understand that question as a question of law, of international law, which the 1985 notes say is governed by international law. It's not something that one refers to the Bible to come up with an answer for. And let me just elaborate one more thing on that point, which I touched on in my remarks. We've got to appreciate the fact that the people that are living in the Eastern Mediterranean represent many different religious traditions, and to simply claim our religion says that this is what must happen in this particular circumstance, it's just not persuasive to people of a different religious tradition. They're not sharing the same presuppositions and worldview. And in fact, it tends to polarize positions, because then there's a rallying around the particular religious tradition. And notice I'm not saying religions, because within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there are different subdivision traditions. So as Ruth said many times, it's very complicated, but one cannot play a religion card and expect that to solve the crises in the Middle East. It's just not going to happen. In fact, it usually makes things worse.
Thank you. Okay, I think a last question, and then we'll have some closing. I have some closing words. Will President Biden, since you both, I'm sure, are very dear friends of our new president, remove the American embassy from Jerusalem? I'm assuming this is going to be an opinion question.
I mean, I'm not competent to answer that question. That's not my area of, I think it's unlikely personally, but my opinion doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
The thing is that the American presidents have for decades been promising to move the embassy to Jerusalem, and it just never happened. So whether I don't personally think that the way that it was done under the last administration was a way that was going to promote peace, and especially the location where it ended up. But Jerusalem is the capital of the modern state of Israel. And the insistence of most countries on not recognizing that and having embassies in Tel Aviv is like countries saying to the United States, well, New York's your most important city. We're going to have our embassies in New York and not have them in Washington. And that's how it feels from an Israeli perspective. So an embassy moved into West Jerusalem would be the normal thing for a country to do if it were going to recognize the capital of a country. And the existence of embassies being elsewhere means that Israel's capital in West Jerusalem was not being recognized. That Trump developed an embassy which is in East Halpia, which is a more disputed area in part of East Jerusalem almost, or right on the border, sends a different set of messages, and that's not my part of my argument.
But thank you for tackling the question.
There's another, the last question there. I don't know if we have time for it,
Go ahead.
Bonnie, but that's sort of an interesting question.
So if the Temple Mount would fall under Jewish control once again, would animal sacrifice be resumed? That is an interesting question.
It's a rather bloody question.
Don't ask me.
The answer to that is complicated. We could say yet again.
Yeah, well, it's true.
Technically, there are people who would say that's what God demands in the Bible. That's what was happening in the temple until it was destroyed by the Romans. And so that's what there are people who are preparing the implements and the know-how to actually be offering sacrifices again. On the other hand, and this is where I prefer to turn, the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel, he was the chief rabbi under the British Mandate, a man named Abraham Isaac Cook, and a wonderful, wonderful, deep thinking person, very, very influential, was a vegetarian. And so he said, he was praying wholeheartedly for the temple to be rebuilt, but not for animal sacrifices. Said no, everything that would be offered there would be vegetable. And so for me personally, this isn't something that I like to think about very much. I sometimes like to, I'm interested in liturgy, so I like to think about trying to figure out, wrap my mind around how it is that people found spiritual expression in animal sacrifices, but it's really foreign for me. And not something that I personally could get excited about having happen again. In fact, I think it would be a bit of a desecration and an embarrassment, but that's my personal opinion.
But that points out something really important that let me underscore. I think Christians sometimes presume that there is a single Jewish point of view on a question. And here we see an example of only two possible answers to the question, Jewish answers. It's just not the case. It's again, much more complicated. There's multiple perspectives, depending largely on how one interprets the tradition to answer questions like this. And there's a spectrum in Judaism, and there's a spectrum in Christianity as well.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you both so much for tackling such a complex and difficult topic. There aren't a whole lot of people out there that would necessarily want to show themselves up on a webinar screen and take on something that is, I don't want to say it's controversial. I guess there's a lot of controversy surrounding Israel, but anyway, I just wanted to thank you both for sharing your wisdom. And I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. We hope you enjoyed learning with Dr. Langer and Dr. Cunningham. We, of course, appreciate their wisdom and their expertise and being with us this evening to share it with us. I wanted to let you know that the session has been recorded, and so in a few days you will find a recording on the Lux Center pages of the Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology website at www.shsst.edu. The Lux Center is pleased to present one more session in this webinar series. Next Wednesday evening, February 10th, Dr. Rebecca Carter-Chand, Acting Director of the Program on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., will speak about Christianity and the Holocaust, action and reaction in challenging times. Also, in preparation for Lent, the Lux Center is hosting a webinar that will be a conversation about the book, Jesus Wasn't Killed by the Jews, with the editor of the book, John M. Sweeney, and book contributors, Sister Mary Boyes, Robert Ellsberg, and Dr. Greg Garrett, to be held on Tuesday, February 16th at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. On Sunday, March 21st at 3 p.m., the Lux Center will present its annual spring lecture with Rabbi Burton Vysotsky. His topic will be Blood Brothers, Jews and Christians as Sibling Rivals. And so I thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and good night.